The room buzzed with the kind of quiet intensity that only money could buy. Adrian Vale sat near the center, his posture as calm as a still lake, radiating authority. Around him, wealth dripped from every surface: leather chairs, polished gold fixtures, crystal chandeliers. Yet the real power was in the air, in the unspoken competition between the bidders. Who could spend the most without blinking? Adrian thrived in this environment. "Lot 17, the auctioneer announced, his voice sharp enough to cut diamonds. A rare Ming Dynasty vase, dated to the 15th century. We'll start the bidding at 5 million. Adrian barely flicked his eyes toward the stage. He had no real interest in the vase itself. He had dozens like it already, tucked away in his many properties. But winning wasn't about need. It was about control. The first bid came in immediately. A man in a red tie raised his paddle. 5 million. 6, came another voice. Adrian didn't move. He let the numbers climb. 7 million, 8 million, watching his competitors out of the corner of his eye. Red tie puffed out his chest and leaned forward, ready to pounce. 10 million, he declared, loud enough to echo. A few polite gasps rippled through the room. Adrian smiled, just barely. He raised his paddle. 15 million. Silence. Red tie sputtered, his face reddening to match his unfortunate fashion choice. 15? That's absurd! Adrian turned his head slightly, fixing the man with a cool, detached stare. Is it? The auctioneer's gavel came down with a satisfying crack. Sold, to Mr. Vale. Adrian gave a single, measured nod. The vase wasn't worth 15 million, but proving that no one else in the room could touch him, that was priceless. You're doing it again, Simon said, leaning in from the chair beside him. Adrian didn't look at him. Doing what? Buying things you don't need just to make a point, Simon replied, exasperation laced in his tone. Adrian finally turned, the corner of his mouth lifting in what could generously be called amusement. If you think it's about the vase, you're missing the point entirely. Simon raised a brow, the clipboard in his hand suddenly looking like a shield. And what point is that, sir? Adrian leaned back, crossing one ankle over his knee. The world belongs to those willing to take what they want. Simon muttered something under his breath that Adrian didn't quite catch, but it didn't matter. His attention had already shifted. The auctioneer droned on about the next lot, but Adrian's focus was on the glossy catalog in his hand. He flipped through it idly, pausing only when something unusual caught his eye. Lot 23. Untouched. Adrian's smirk deepened, his gaze sharpening with interest. Prepare the paperwork, he said, his tone quiet but commanding. Simon hesitated, peering over his shoulder at the catalog. For what? Adrian closed the booklet with a sharp snap, his voice carrying a hint of dangerous amusement. Lot 23. I have a feeling this one is going to be special. The auctioneer's voice rose in the background, announcing the next bid, but Adrian was already a step ahead, his mind turning over the possibilities. And just like that, the room felt smaller. The game wasn't about the vase, the room, or even the money anymore. It was about control. And Adrian Vale always won. His fingers brushed the edge of the catalog, lingering on the number. Lot 23. Pure. Untouched. A blank slate. Perfect. Chapter 1. Ivy Whitaker's day began the same way it always did, with a blaring alarm clock and a wish that she could throw it out the window. Unfortunately, buying a new alarm clock wasn't in the budget. She groaned, smacking the snooze button with enough force to make it wobble. 5 more minutes wouldn't hurt, right? Except 5 minutes turned into 10, and 10 turned into 15, and suddenly Ivy was out the door, shoes untied, shirt half tucked, and hair doing its best impression of a bird's nest. The smell of burnt toast hit her before she even stepped into the diner. Gilda's cafe wasn't just a hole in the wall. It was the hole crawled into when it was tired. Ivy tied on her faded apron as she slid behind the counter. The smell of old grease and burnt coffee greeted her like an unenthusiastic roommate. "Morning, sunshine," barked Gilda, the cafe's owner and unofficial queen of scowls. She waved a spatula in Ivy's direction, flinging grease like confetti. Ivy dodged it with practiced ease. "Morning, Gilda. What's on the menu today?" "Heartburn and regret," Gilda replied. Ivy grabbed her order pad and forced a smile. "My specialty." The first half of her shift passed in a blur of greasy plates, lukewarm coffee, and customers who had the nerve to complain about the service while leaving pennies for tips. By the time her lunch break rolled around, Ivy was already dreaming about quitting. Not that she could, of course. As she stepped outside to breathe in some much-needed fresh air, her day officially went from bad to worse. "Miss Whitaker?" Ivy cringed. She knew that voice. Mr. Grayson, her landlord, appeared like a storm cloud in an ill-fitting suit. He was the kind of man whose face seemed permanently scrunched, like he'd just bitten into a lemon. "You're behind on rent again," he said, wagging his finger. 3 days, Ivy, 3, or you're out." Ivy rubbed her temples. "I know, Mr. Grayson, I'm working on it." "Work harder," he snapped. "And fix the front steps while you're at it. Someone's gonna break their neck." He turned on his heel and stomped off, leaving Ivy staring at the cracked pavement. She sighed, mentally adding "become a construction worker" to her to-do list. Her problems didn't end there. After her shift, she stopped by the pharmacy to pick up her brother Noah's medication. The pharmacist handed her the bill with an apologetic look. "It'll be $200. Ivy blinked. "For 2 pills?" The pharmacist shrugged. "Insurance doesn't cover it anymore." "Of course it doesn't," Ivy muttered, digging into her wallet. The grand total of her cash, $20 and a coupon for half-pig pizza. She handed the coupon to the pharmacist. "Will this help?" It wouldn't. By the time Ivy got home, the water company had left a bright orange notice on the door, something about unpaid bills and shutting off her service in 48 hours. Great. She didn't need water. Who needed water? Definitely not someone who spent 12 hours a day sweating over diner plates. She dropped her bag onto the couch, groaning as she sank down beside it. Noah peeked around the corner, his curly hair sticking up in every direction. "You okay, Ivy?" "Totally fine," she said with a forced smile. "Trust, juggling a few flaming torches, while blindfolded on a unicycle." Noah laughed, but Ivy could see the worry in his eyes. He was only 14, but he carried the weight of their situation as if it were his own. She ruffled his hair and told him to go do his homework, even though she knew he'd probably spend the next hour Googling ways to sell a kidney. Later that evening, Ivy was back at the diner for the late shift. Exhaustion clung to her like syrup on a pancake. She was wiping down a table when 2 men in suits slid into a booth, their conversation loud enough to carry across the room. "I'm telling you," said the first man. "Club Vesper is the solution. 1 auction and all my debts were gone." The second man leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make Ivy strain to hear. "But it's not just money they take. You know that, right?" The first man waved a dismissive hand. "Details. What matters is freedom. Besides, some people don't have a choice." They laughed, the sound sharp and cold. Ivy's ears perked up. Club Vesper? An auction? She knew she shouldn't be curious, but the words stuck in her head like a burr. By the time she crawled into bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about it. A flyer peeked out of her pocket, the one she'd swiped from the table after the men left. She smoothed it out, the sleek black paper glinting in the moonlight. "Erase your debts," it promised. "For a price." Ivy stared at the flyer, her heart sinking. Desperation whispered in her ear, but fear wasn't far behind. What kind of price were they talking about? She crumpled the paper in her fist, but she couldn't make herself throw it away. Ivy lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling as the flyer sat on her bedside table, daring her to make a choice. The next morning, Ivy dragged herself out of bed, the crumpled flyer still sitting on her nightstand like a bad decision waiting to happen. And yet, it was all she could think about as she rushed through her morning routine. As Ivy bolted out the door, she almost tripped over the neighbor's cat, who hissed at her like she'd personally insulted its family. "Good morning to you too, Mr. Whiskers," she muttered, hopping over him. The diner was already in full swing when she arrived. Gilda was shouting at someone in the kitchen, and the coffee machine was making noises like it wanted to retire immediately. Ivy tied on her apron, bracing herself for another long day. Halfway through her shift, a customer waved her over. A woman in a fur coat so fluffy it looked like she'd skinned a yeti. "Excuse me," Fluffy Coat said, holding up her coffee cup. "This is cold." "I'm sorry about that," Ivy replied, reaching for the cup. Fluffy Coat snatched it back. "I didn't say I wanted a refill, just heat this up." Ivy stared at her. "You want me to microwave your coffee?" Fluffy Coat gave her an expectant look. "Is that a problem?" "Not at all," Ivy said, flashing her best fake smile. "Let me just check with our Michelin-starred chef." She took the cup and walked off, muttering, "Gilda's gonna love this one." By the time her break rolled around, Ivy was practically glued to the counter, her legs begging for mercy. She fished the flyer out of her pocket, smoothing it out on the sticky countertop. "Erase your debts," it read again, in sleek silver letters. Below that, an address was scrawled, accompanied by an equally ominous line. "For a price." "You okay there, kid?" Gilda's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Ivy shoved the flyer into her pocket. "Yeah, just thinking." Gilda snorted. "Don't do too much of that. Thinking's a slippery slope." By the end of her shift, Ivy's nerves were fried, but the flyer in her pocket seemed heavier than ever. She tried to distract herself, checking on Noah at home and picking up around the apartment, but the weight of her problems refused to leave her alone. The landlord's warning rang in her ears. The water bill sat like a threat on the counter. And Noah's prescription still sat unfilled, the pharmacy's receipt mocking her from her bag. By midnight, she was pacing her tiny living room. "This is crazy," she said out loud, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's probably illegal, or worse." But what was the alternative? Work herself into the ground for scraps? Lose their apartment? Let Noah's health keep slipping because she couldn't afford his meds? She glanced at her brother's bedroom door. The faint sound of his video game floated through the thin walls. He deserved better. With a frustrated sigh, Ivy grabbed the flyer and smoothed it out again. Her fingers traced the shiny silver letters. "For a price." "What kind of price?" she muttered, her stomach twisting. She shoved the paper back into her pocket. The idea was ridiculous, dangerous. But even as she climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Ivy lay awake long after the lights were off, the flyer sitting on the nightstand again. It seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, daring her to make the first move. You popped out of nowhere like a horror movie villain who'd been waiting all night to scare someone. Ivy had barely stepped out of the apartment before Mr. Grayson pretended to see him. "Sorry, Mr. Grayson, I was busy this morning. I was..." "Busy? What?" He squinted suspiciously. "Counting the money you don't have? Wow, rude." Ivy stopped in her tracks, letting out a long, dramatic sigh. "Look, Mr. Grayson, I'll get the rent, okay? I just need a little more time." He scoffed, his hands on his hips. "Time doesn't pay the bills, Miss Whitaker. You've got 2 days or you're out, and don't think I won't call the police this time." As he stomped off, Ivy resisted the urge to shout, "Enjoy being the villain in someone else's story." Instead, she huffed, her cheeks burning with frustration. Back at the diner, the morning rush felt more chaotic than usual, but Ivy's mind was elsewhere. Between Mr. Grayson's threats, the mounting bills, and the mysterious flyer still tucked in her bag, she was on the verge of a mental breakdown. The words from the 2 suited men kept echoing in her head. One auction, and all my debts were gone. During a lull between customers, Ivy pulled out her phone and hesitated. Typing Club Vesper into a search engine felt like opening Pandora's box. But what choice did she have? Bills wouldn't pay themselves, and her tips wouldn't pay anything else, and the first few search results seemed normal enough. Upscale clubs, random Yelp reviews, and one very questionable blog titled, "I sold my soul to Club Vesper and all I got was this lousy t-shirt." Ivy clicked anyway. Morning. Enter at your own risk. The website's bold red letters screamed at Ivy like a neon sign outside a haunted house. The blog detailed stories from supposed clients who had attended the club's infamous auctions. Most entries were vague, talking about massive debts being wiped out for a price. A few, though, hinted at something darker: strict contracts, submission to mysterious owners, and life-changing deals that weren't always for the better. One post made her stomach turn. Club Vesper isn't just a place to fix your finances. It's where the powerful come to collect people. You don't own yourself anymore. They own you. She slammed her phone down like it had bitten her. "Yeah, that sounds bad," she muttered to herself. Still, a tiny part of her brain wouldn't let it go. If it was so dangerous, why did people keep going? Meanwhile, somewhere far too fancy for Ivy's world, Adrian Vale sat in his glass-walled office, the city skyline sprawling behind him. Everything about him screamed dangerous success, from his perfectly tailored suit to the way his icy blue eyes scanned the screen in front of him. Evelyn, his assistant, stood nearby, holding a tablet and wearing an expression that said she'd seen this routine 100 times and still wasn't impressed. "Interesting," Adrian murmured, tapping the screen. Evelyn tilted her head. "Interesting how? She's broke, overworked, and drowning in medical bills. That's half the applicants we get." Adrian leaned back in his chair, folding his hands under his chin. "Look at her." Evelyn glanced at the screen where Ivy's profile was displayed. A picture of a tired but kind-looking young woman with wild curls and a forced smile. Below that, a mountain of debts. "She's desperate," Evelyn pointed out. "They all are. Not like this one." Adrian's voice softened, taking on a thoughtful edge. "She's resilient. She's been crushed by life, but she hasn't broken. Yet." Evelyn arched a brow. "So, what? You want to break her?" Adrian's lips curved into a small, sharp smirk. "I want to see how far she can bend before she shatters." Evelyn sighed, scrolling through Ivy's information. "She's not even signed up for the auction yet. What makes you think she'll show up?" "She will." Adrian's confidence was unnerving. He tapped the screen again, zooming in on Ivy's face. "Find out everything about her, where she works, where she lives, everything." Evelyn hesitated. "You're getting fixated again." Adrian's smirk only deepened. "It's not fixation, it's opportunity." "You mean control," Evelyn muttered under her breath, but she didn't argue further. Ivy was still staring at her phone when Gilda yelled her name. "Ivy, table 3's been waiting on ketchup for 20 minutes. You hiding the bottle or something?" "Sorry." Ivy bolted, grabbing the ketchup and rushing to the table, but even as she worked, her mind wandered. The danger was obvious, but so was the temptation. No more rent threats, no more unpaid bills, no more watching Noah struggle. The flyer practically burned in her bag, waiting for her to make a choice. In his sleek office, Adrian tapped Ivy's profile one last time. His smirk widened as he murmured, "She doesn't know it yet, but she'll be mine." Chapter 3. Ivy stood in front of the building, staring up at it like it was a haunted house and she was the idiot protagonist who just had to check out the basement. Club Vesper didn't look like a club. It looked like the headquarters of a supervillain. Sleek black glass, sharp angles, and just enough dim lighting to make you second-guess your life choices. "Okay, Ivy," she whispered to herself, tugging at the hem of her jacket. "You've faced worse. Remember the diner on karaoke night? You survived that." Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The lobby alone was enough to make her feel out of place. Crystal chandeliers dangled from a high ceiling, their light bouncing off marble floors so shiny she could see her scuffed shoes reflected in them. Everyone else wore tailored suits and gowns that probably cost more than her rent. Ivy shifted uncomfortably as she approached the reception desk. The woman behind it, who looked like she'd been assembled in a lab specifically to intimidate people, gave Ivy a once-over that could have frozen water. "His name?" the woman asked, her tone as cold as the AC blasting through the room. "Ivy Whitaker," Ivy mumbled, clutching her bag like a lifeline. The woman typed something into her computer, then handed Ivy a card. "Orientation room B. Down the hall, third door on the left." "Thanks," Ivy said, even though the woman had already moved on to ignoring her. Orientation room B, aka the Room of Doom. The moment Ivy stepped in, she knew she was way out of her depth. The room was filled with people in designer masks that covered the top half of their faces, making them look like they'd just stepped out of some creepy masquerade ball. Each mask was more elaborate than the last, gold, filigree, jewels, feathers. But Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that they were all staring at her. Which, let's be honest, they probably were. She wasn't exactly blending in with her bargain bin blouse and her "please don't notice me" energy. "Welcome, everyone," a man's voice boomed. Ivy turned to see a tall, slim figure at the front of the room. He wore a simple black mask, but his slicked back hair and expensive suit screamed, "Important guy you shouldn't mess with." "My name is Mr. Carson," he said, his tone warm but with just enough edge to remind you who was in charge. "You've all been invited here because you're looking for a solution to your, unique problems." Unique problems, Ivy thought. What a polite way to say you're broke and desperate. Mr. Carson gestured toward a table covered in sleek black folders. "The contracts you'll sign tonight are simple. In exchange for financial freedom, you agree to follow the terms set by your bidder. Full compliance is expected. You will belong to them. Your time, your choices, even your future. Do not take this lightly." Ivy's stomach flipped. Belong to them? That sounded less like paying off debt and more like getting sold at auction. Someone next to her laughed softly, and Ivy realized it wasn't a funny laugh. It was the kind of laugh that said, "I know something you don't, and it's terrifying." Meanwhile, in Adrian's penthouse. Adrian leaned back in his chair, a glass of bourbon resting in his hand. Multiple screens were mounted on the wall in front of him, each one streaming live footage from the orientation room. "Do you always watch these things like it's reality TV?" Evelyn asked, perched on the couch with her ever-present tablet. Adrian didn't bother looking at her. "This isn't reality TV. This is strategy." Evelyn rolled her eyes. "Right, because strategy involves staring at a woman like you've already picked out her wedding dress?" His gaze locked on one particular screen, where Ivy stood off to the side, shifting from foot to foot. She looked nervous, overwhelmed, and completely out of place, and yet Adrian found himself captivated. "There," he said, pointing at the screen. Evelyn squinted. "Her? She's about 2 minutes from passing out." "It's perfect," Adrian murmured, his voice almost reverent. Evelyn sighed dramatically. "Here we go." And back in the room, Ivy tried to focus as Mr. Carson droned on about the terms of the contracts, but her brain kept getting stuck on words like obedience and belonging. She glanced at the folder in her hands, the sleek black cover practically begging her to open it. Her fingers trembled as she flipped it open. Inside was a contract filled with legal jargon she didn't understand, but the dollar amount written at the bottom was impossible to ignore. Enough to pay off everything? Her chest tightened as reality sank in. If she signed, she could save Noah, pay the rent, keep the lights on. But the cost? What was the cost? Ivy Whitaker. Mr. Carson's voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She looked up to see him staring directly at her. "You must decide," he said, his tone as smooth as butter but carrying the weight of a threat. "No one is forced to say, but once you sign, there is no turning back." Ivy's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Around her, the masked attendees watched silently, their eyes glittering behind their ornate disguises. On the monitor, Adrian watched as Ivy's hand hovered over the dotted line. Her lips pressed together and she bit down nervously, just hard enough to leave a faint red mark. "She's going to run," Evelyn said, her tone neutral but mildly curious. "No," Adrian replied, his voice low and certain. His eyes sharpened as he leaned forward slightly. "She's stronger than that." The corner of his mouth curved into a smirk as he watched Ivy's pen waver, then pause. "Sign it," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do it." Ivy's fingers trembled as the pen hovered above the contract. Somewhere far away, Adrian's smirk deepened. Chapter 4. Ivy was sure of one thing. Life had an impeccable sense of timing, the kind of timing that made you drop your toast butter side down when you were already running late. Her phone buzzed on the counter as she stirred a pot of ramen, the steam fogging up her glasses. "Please don't be bad news," she muttered, picking it up. It was bad news. "This is St. Luke's Hospital," the voice on the other end began, a tone that could only belong to someone who had perfected the art of ruining your day. "We're calling about Noah Whitaker's medication. The payment is overdue, and we'll need it immediately to refill his prescription." Ivy's stomach twisted. "How much?" $250. She almost laughed, but it came out as a choking sound instead. $250? For what? Magic beans? The voice on the line didn't waver. "Payment is required by Friday, or we'll have to pause his treatment." Ivy hung up and slumped against the counter. The ramen bubbled in the pot, mocking her with its 99-cent existence. Noah shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "Hey, is everything okay?" he asked, his curly hair sticking out in a way that would have been cute if Ivy weren't on the verge of a breakdown. "Totally," she lied, stirring the ramen like it was the answer to all her problems. "Dinner's almost ready." Noah squinted at her. "You only make ramen when you're stressed. What's going on?" "I'm fine," she said quickly, too quickly. Noah frowned but didn't push it. Instead, he grabbed a fork and poked at the pot. "Well, at least you didn't burn it this time." Ivy swatted his arm with the wooden spoon. "Eat your food, kid." Later that night, Ivy sat on the couch, staring at her phone. The Club Vesper flyer sat beside her like a smug little gremlin, taunting her with its promise of solutions. "This is insane," she said to the empty room. "It's a scam, or a cult, or both." But the hospital bill loomed in her mind, along with rent, the water bill, and Noah's worried face. With shaking hands, She picked up the flyer and dialed the number. Meanwhile, in Adrian's world of fancy chaos, Adrian Vale sat in his office, flipping through a thick folder labeled Ivy Whitaker. His desk was an artful mess of sleek gadgets, important-looking papers, and a single mug that read, "World's Most Dangerous Boss." "She's ordinary," Evelyn said, glancing over his shoulder. Adrian's gaze flicked up, a sharp edge in his blue eyes. "You think so?" "Well, she's broke, works in a diner, and lives in a dump," Evelyn replied. "Pretty standard desperate applicant material." Adrian leaned back, flipping through Ivy's file like it was a bell-selling novel. Her picture stared back at him. Frazzled hair, a forced smile, and eyes that held just enough defiance to make her interesting. "She's different," Adrian said, his tone softer now. Evelyn snorted. "You always say that." Adrian ignored her, focusing on the details. Her endless debts, her brother's medical needs, her history of scraping by no matter how impossible the odds. He smirked, his fingers tracing the edge of her photo. "She's resilient," he murmured. "She doesn't break easily." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "And that's a good thing?" "It's fascinating." His smirk deepened. "She bends, but she doesn't break." Yeah. Evelyn sighed, scrolling through her tablet. "You're not just going to pick her because she looks like a sad puppy, are you?" Adrian chuckled, low and dangerous. "It's not pity, Evelyn. It's curiosity. I want to see how far she'll go." "Back to Ivy's apartment?" Ivy stared at the screen of her laptop, where a Club Vesper application form glowed back at her like a neon sign that read "Bad life choices ahead." Address. Debt total. She filled out each line, hesitating over the box labeled "Reason for Application." How was she supposed to summarize, "My life's a dumpster fire and I'm drowning," into one sentence? She finally typed, "Financial hardship and medical expenses." The cursor blinked at her mockingly. Before she could change her mind, she hit submit. Back to Adrian. The notification pinged on Adrian's screen. Ivy Whitaker's application had been finalized. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming as he skimmed the details. "She's in," he said, his voice like a predator spotting its prey. Evelyn rolled her eyes. "Congratulations, you've officially signed up another broken soul." Adrian's smirk turned sharp. "Not broken. Not yet." 2 days later, Ivy sat in a small office at Club Vesper, clutching a pen like it might electrocute her. The contract in front of her was thick, filled with words she didn't understand and promises she didn't trust. "This will cover all your debts," Mr. Carson said smoothly, pointing to the signature line. "All you have to do is sign." Her hand trembled as she lowered the pen. The hospital bills, the landlord, the weight of everything, it all flashed through her mind. Her chest felt tight. "You don't have to decide today," Carson added, though his tone suggested she did. Ivy closed her eyes, took a shaky breath, and signed her name. In his penthouse, Adrian watched the live feed as Ivy's pen moved across the contract. His smirk widened into something far more dangerous. "The auction begins," he said softly, his voice filled with satisfaction. Ivy dropped the pen, her heart racing. Across the city, Adrian leaned back in his chair, his predatory smile promising, "You're mine now." Chapter 5. Ivy hated hospitals. The smell of antiseptic, the dull hum of machines, the terrible coffee, all of it made her want to bolt for the nearest exit. But today the place felt especially heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting to swallow her whole. She weaved through the halls, clutching a bouquet of slightly wilted daisies. She couldn't afford the fresher ones, but Noah wouldn't care. He'd probably turn them into a science experiment. "Room 304, she muttered under her breath, stopping outside the door. She took a deep breath, pasted on a smile, and pushed it open. Noah was sitting up in bed, his nose buried in a graphic novel. His IV dripped steadily beside him, and the heart monitor beeped like it was trying to create a new pop song. "Hey, Einstein," Ivy said, setting the flowers on the bedside table. Noah looked up, grinning. "Hey, did you know if you microwave grapes, they can turn into plasma?" Ivy blinked. "I did not. And now I know what you're doing when I'm not home." "Come on, it's science," he said, holding up the book as if that explained everything. She laughed, but it felt hollow. He looked okay now. Better than last week, at least. But she knew the truth. The nurses' whispered updates, the doctor's grim expressions, the bills piling up on her counter. She pulled a chair next to his bed, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her shirt. "How are you feeling today?" "Pretty good," Noah said, though his voice was a little too cheerful. He tilted his head, studying her. "What's up with you? You look like you've been hit by a bus." "Thanks," she said dryly. Always the charmer. Noah smirked but didn't push. Instead, he leaned back against his pillows, closing his eyes like the conversation had drained him. Ivy watched him for a moment, her chest tightening. She tried to imagine life without him, but her brain refused to go there. Instead, it painted another nightmare. Noah hooked up to machines, struggling to breathe, and her standing helplessly by, unable to afford his care. Her vision blurred. She rubbed her eyes and forced herself to focus. "I'm going to fix this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Noah opened one eye, giving her a tired grin. "You're the best, Ivy, but you worry too much. I'll be fine." She nodded, even though every instinct in her screamed otherwise. Meanwhile, in Adrian's world of ruthlessness, Adrian Vale stood in his office, the skyline behind him lit like a glittering reminder of his dominance. On his desk lay a stack of dossiers, each one detailing potential auction participants. He flipped through them like a man scanning a menu, pausing only when something caught his interest. "She's signed," Evelyn said from the doorway, holding her tablet like it contained the secrets of the universe. Adrian's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Good. She's still new to this," Evelyn added as if testing the waters. "If she backs out, she won't." His tone was final, as if backing out wasn't an option for anyone in his world. Evelyn sighed but didn't argue. Instead, she handed him another folder. "Here's the list of competitors for Lot 23. You might want to review your strategy." Adrian flipped the folder open, his smirk vanishing. The names listed inside were familiar: powerful, wealthy, and annoyingly persistent. "Amateurs," he muttered, tossing the folder onto the desk. "Some of them are amateurs," Evelyn agreed, "but a few have deeper pockets than even you." Adrian's gaze darkened. "Not for long." "Do I even want to know what that means?" Evelyn asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Adrian didn't respond. Instead, he poured himself a drink and leaned against the desk, his eyes narrowing as his mind worked through the next move. He didn't just want to win Lot 23. He needed to. "She's not a thing, you know," Evelyn said, her voice softer now. Adrian glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "No," he said finally. "But she's mine." Back to Ivy. The sun was setting as Ivy left the hospital, her feet dragging as if the weight of her thoughts had spread to her entire body. The scent of daisies still lingered on her hands, a bittersweet reminder of the visit. She clutched her bag tightly, the corner of the club Vesper contract poking out of the zipper. Her steps faltered, and she leaned against a bus stop sign, staring at the horizon. Her mind raced. Was this the answer? Selling herself to strangers just to save Noah? What if it wasn't enough? What if it broke her in ways she couldn't imagine? But then she saw Noah's face in her mind, his crooked grin and stubborn optimism, and her heart twisted. She couldn't fail him. Ivy reached into her bag, pulling out the contract. The words blurred in the dim light, but the signature line stood out, daring her to cross it. With trembling hands, she pulled out a pen and signed her name. Meanwhile, Adrian. In the shadows of an opulent auction stage, Adrian stood watching the final preparations. His smirk returned as he glanced at the list of participants. His competitors might be powerful, but they lacked his precision, his hunger for control. "The auction begins tomorrow," Evelyn reminded him. Adrian nodded, his gaze sharp as a blade. "And it ends with me." Ivy clutched Noah's hand in her memory, her resolve unshakable. Across the city, Adrian's shadow stretched over the auction stage, his predatory grin promising, "It's already over." Chapter 6. Ivy stood on the stage, frozen like a deer in headlights. Except instead of headlights, it was a spotlight glaring down on her, and instead of a forest, she was surrounded by a sea of masked people in tuxedos and gowns. Her heart pounded like it was auditioning for a drumline. She clenched her fists at her sides, trying to keep them from shaking. "Lot 23, the auctioneer announced, his voice smooth and practiced, like he sold people for a living. Which, apparently, he did. Untouched, resilient, a blank slate with endless potential. Ivy's stomach flipped. Untouched? Resilient? I'm a person, not a collectible Barbie. The room buzzed with murmurs as the bidders leaned forward in their seats, their masks glittering under the chandelier lights. Ivy felt their stares like 100 invisible pokes, each one whispering, "How much do you think she's worth?" The auctioneer cleared his throat. "We'll start the bidding at 1 million. Ivy almost choked. "1 million? For her?" She wasn't sure if she should be insulted or flattered. A paddle shot up. 1 million, said a man in the front row, his voice cool and detached. 2 million, someone else called, their voice muffled behind a silver mask. The bids climbed higher, the numbers bouncing around the room like a game of dodgeball. Ivy couldn't escape. Her knees wobbled, and she wondered if she could faint gracefully enough to end this nightmare. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Adrian Vale sat in the back row, his presence a shadow that stretched over the room. He didn't wear a mask. He didn't need one. The sharp line of his jaw and the cold steel in his eyes were more intimidating than any disguise could be. His gaze never left Ivy. "She looks like she's about to pass out," Evelyn muttered beside him, her tablet balanced on her knee. "She won't," Adrian replied, his voice low and calm. "She's stronger than she knows." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as the bidding reached 5 million. Adrian finally leaned forward, his hand resting on his paddle. 6 million. The room fell silent. Ivy's breath caught in her throat as she searched for the source of the voice. Adrian didn't move, his expression unreadable. The weight of his presence pressed down on her, even from across the room. 7 million? Someone dared to say, their paddle trembling slightly. Adrian's paddle rose again. 10 million! The air crackled with tension. Ivy couldn't decide what was worse, the ridiculous amount of money being thrown around, or the fact that her future was being discussed like she was a limited edition collectible. She squinted toward the back of the room, trying to see who the deep-voiced bidder was, but the spotlight blinded her. 15 million. What did they think she was? The Mona Lisa? 20 million? Adrian said, his voice slicing through the tension like a knife. The crowd gasped. Even the auctioneer paused, blinking as if he hadn't heard correctly. 20 million? The rival bidder snapped. This is ridiculous. Adrian's paddle lowered as he stood, his movements deliberate and controlled. His eyes locked onto the rival bidder, who visibly shrank under the weight of Adrian's icy gaze. "This isn't a game," Adrian said, his voice as cold as a winter storm. "She's mine." The room held its breath. No one dared speak, let alone bid. The auctioneer glanced nervously around the room before raising his gavel. "Sold! To Mr. Vale!" The gavel's crack echoed through the hall, and Ivy's legs nearly gave out. She had been sold. Adrian stepped out of the shadows, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. The crowd parted as if afraid to be in his path. He walked with the kind of confidence that said, "I own this room, and everyone in it knows it." Ivy's gaze snapped to him, and her breath hitched. He was tall, sharply dressed, and terrifyingly calm. His eyes locked onto hers, freezing her in place. Adrian stopped at the edge of the stage, his smirk subtle but unmistakable. "Welcome to your new life," he said, his voice low and smooth. Ivy stared at him, tears brimming in her eyes as her reality came crashing down. Adrian extended a hand toward her, his expression unreadable but full of promise and danger. "It starts now," he said, leaving Ivy no choice but to take the plunge. Chapter 7. Ivy clutched her bag like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to earth as Adrian's sleek black car glided through the city. She'd been in taxis before, cheap, slightly sticky ones with seats that smelled like questionable life choices, but this was a spaceship on wheels. "Are all your cars this fancy?" she asked, trying to fill the suffocating silence. Adrian didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Yes." "Cool," Ivy mumbled, shrinking into her seat. Talking to Adrian was like trying to have a conversation with a well-dressed iceberg. The car pulled up to a skyscraper that looked like it had been designed by a billionaire with a thing for supervillain layers. The building was all sharp angles and mirrored glass, reflecting the city lights like it was too good to mingle with the buildings around it. "This is your place?" Ivy asked, craning her neck to take it all in. Adrian finally turned to her, one brow arched. "Do you have a problem with that?" "Nope, just wondering if it comes with a bat signal." Welcome to the lair. Adrian's penthouse was somehow even more intimidating than the building itself. The elevator opened directly into his living room, which was a cavernous space of steel, glass, and clean lines. Everything was black, white, or gray. Like the furniture had been told, no fun allowed. "Wow," Ivy said, stepping inside. "It's, shiny." Adrian didn't respond. He strode across the room, his long strides eating up the distance to a massive glass wall that offered a stunning view of the city below. He turned, his eyes locking onto Ivy. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a pristine white couch that looked like it cost more than her life. Ivy hesitated, wondering if she'd leave a dirt trail just by breathing near it. She perched on the edge, her hands gripping her bag tightly. Adrian remained standing, towering over her like a storm cloud in a tailored suit. "I trust you understand the terms of our arrangement." Sure," Ivy said, her voice wobbling. "You help me, I help you. Everyone's happy, right?" His lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. Not exactly. "You don't help me, Ivy. You obey me." Her stomach flipped. "That sounds intense." Adrian's eyes didn't waver. "It is." He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. "For the next year, you'll follow my instructions without question. In return, your debts will be erased and your brother's medical care will be fully covered. Do you understand?" Ivy swallowed hard. "What kind of instructions?" Adrian tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he enjoyed piecing together. "Nothing unreasonable, but you'll find I don't tolerate defiance." "Okay, cool. No defiance. Got it," she said, her voice higher than she'd intended. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the back of the couch. "You signed a contract, Ivy. Your obedience isn't optional." Her heart thundered in her chest as his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. She'd known this arrangement would be intense, but hearing it from Adrian, seeing the quiet power in his eyes made it all too real. "Look," she said, trying to summon some courage. "I'm not used to this, whatever this is. So maybe you could, I don't know, cut me some slack?" Adrian's lips curved into a faint smirk. "Slack? That's not how this works." Ivy blinked. "Do you ever laugh, like at a joke or a funny YouTube video? Or is that against the rules too?" For a split second, Adrian's smirk deepened, as if he was genuinely amused, but the moment passed quickly, and his voice dropped to a softer, more dangerous tone. "Tomorrow we begin your training." Adrian leaned closer, his breath ghosting over her ear. "I suggest you get some rest. You'll need it." Ivy's pulse raced as he straightened and walked away, leaving her alone on the too-clean couch with nothing but the weight of her decision, and the growing realization that she had no idea what she'd just gotten herself into. Chapter 8. Ivy had spent her first day in Adrian's penthouse wandering around like a cat in a new home, cautiously curious and mildly terrified. The sleek steel and glass interior felt less like a home and more like the lair of a Bond villain. Every corner seemed to whisper, "Don't touch anything." By mid-afternoon, she'd decided to hide in the library, which, unsurprisingly, was enormous. Shelves stretched to the ceiling, filled with books that looked more decorative than read. She ran her fingers along the spines, trying to focus on titles instead of her ever-spiraling thoughts. "I see you've found the one room that doesn't feel like a spaceship," a voice said. Ivy jumped, spinning around to find Evelyn standing in the doorway, holding a tablet and smirking. Adrian's assistant had the aura of someone who could casually balance an apocalypse while sipping an espresso. "Sorry," Ivy mumbled. "Was I not supposed to be in here?" Evelyn waved a hand. "Relax. If you weren't supposed to be here, Adrian would have locked the door. Though knowing him, he probably considered it." Ivy raised an eyebrow. "Is he always like this? Controlling? Intense? Broody?" Evelyn ticked off each adjective on her fingers. "Pretty much, but don't let it scare you. There's a method to his madness." "Yeah, well, his madness feels a lot like stress for me," Ivy muttered. Evelyn chuckled. "Look, I'm going to give you some advice. Adrian isn't the kind of guy you argue with. You pick your battles, follow the rules, and maybe, just maybe, you'll survive this with your sanity intact." "That's comforting," Ivy said dryly. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe, her smirk softening. "He's not as scary as he looks, you know. Underneath all that Dark Lord energy, there's an actual human being." "Is there, though?" Ivy asked, crossing her arms. "Because right now, I'm not convinced." Evelyn laughed. "Dinner's at 7, don't be late." Ivy arrived in the dining room at exactly 6:59, wearing the simple black dress Adrian had left for her. She'd debated rebelling and wearing her favorite jeans instead, but something about Adrian's earlier words, "Your obedience isn't optional," had stuck in her mind. The table was absurdly long, like it had been designed for medieval banquets, but Adrian sat at the head, his gaze fixed on her as she entered. "You're on time," he said, his voice even. "Was that a test?" she asked, sliding into the chair he'd indicated. "Everything is a test," he replied, pouring her a glass of wine. The food arrived on plates so elegant Ivy half expected them to float. She poked at her meal with a fork, trying to suppress the awkwardness bubbling inside her. Adrian, of course, looked completely at ease. "How are you settling in?" "It's different," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Big adjustment." His eyes flicked to hers, sharp and unreadable. "You'll adapt." "Great. Can't wait," she said with a tight smile. For a while they ate in silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound. Then Adrian set down his fork and leaned back, studying her. "You seem tense." Ivy paused mid-bite. "Gee, I wonder why." His lips twitched, almost a smirk. "Come here." She blinked. "What?" "Come here," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ivy hesitated but stood, walking over to his side of the table. He motioned for her to kneel beside him, and her heart started pounding. "This is weird," she said, trying to laugh it off. "It's not weird. It's necessary," Adrian replied. "You'll learn to follow instructions without question. Start by rubbing my shoulders." She stared at him. "You want a massage? During dinner? Is that a problem?" Ivy rolled her eyes but placed her hands on his shoulders, kneading the tension beneath the fabric of his suit. She half expected him to make some smug comment, but instead he closed his eyes, a faint sigh escaping his lips. "You're good at this," he murmured. "Yeah, well, I've had a lot of practice. Stress runs in my family," Adrian chuckled softly, the sound so unexpected it threw her off balance. "I can see that." For a moment, the air between them shifted. Ivy caught a glimpse of something beneath his steely exterior, a flicker of vulnerability, a trace of humanity. Then he opened his eyes, and the moment vanished. "Enough," he said, his voice regaining its edge. "Sit." She obeyed, sliding back into her chair. "We're starting to understand," Adrian said, his gaze fixed on her. "This arrangement isn't about convenience. It's about control." "Yeah, I'm picking up on that," Ivy replied, her sarcasm slipping out before she could stop it. Adrian smirked. "Good. You'll need that wit to survive me." Her stomach fluttered, though she wasn't sure if it was fear or something else. After dinner, Adrian stood and approached her, his fingers brushing her wrist. The touch was light but sent a shiver down her spine. "You'll learn what it means to belong to me," he said softly, his breath ghosting over her skin. Ivy's heart raced as she stared at him, torn between the urge to run and the inexplicable pull that kept her rooted in place. Chapter 9. Ivy stared at the dress laid out on the bed like it was a bad joke. It was sleek, black, and low-cut, the kind of thing you'd see on a runway or in a spy movie, not on someone like her. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, crossing her arms. Adrian had left strict instructions for her to wear it to dinner that evening. Apparently obedience extended to her wardrobe choices too, but Ivy had already spent the past 2 days feeling like she was trapped in someone else's life, and she wasn't about to lose herself completely. "Nope," she said out loud, shoving the dress into the back of the closet. Instead, she grabbed her favorite pair of jeans and a simple top. It wasn't glamorous, but it was her. When Ivy entered the dining room, Adrian was already seated, his posture as composed as ever. His eyes swept over her, and she could almost feel the temperature in the room drop. "You didn't wear the dress," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "I didn't feel like it," Ivy replied, lifting her chin. Adrian's gaze sharpened, and he set down his wineglass with deliberate care. "Excuse me? I'm not a doll you can dress up," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "If this whole arrangement means losing who I am, then forget it." For a long moment, Adrian didn't speak. The silence was so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then he stood, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "You signed a contract, Ivy," he said, his tone quiet but dangerous. "You agreed to my terms." "I didn't agree to give up my free will," she shot back, her heart pounding. Adrian stopped in front of her, his towering presence making her feel small and vulnerable. He reached out, his fingers brushing her jaw with a gentleness that didn't match the intensity in his eyes. "Careful," he murmured, his voice soft but firm. "You're playing a dangerous game." Before Ivy could respond, Adrian grabbed her wrist, not hard, but firmly enough to make it clear she wasn't going anywhere. He guided her to a chair by the window, gesturing for her to sit. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Teaching you a lesson," he said simply. He knelt in front of her, taking off one of her shoes with deliberate slowness. Ivy froze, her pulse racing as he began massaging her foot. It wasn't rough, but it wasn't gentle either. It was calculated, like he was reminding her who was in control. "Adrian!" "Be quiet," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. She clenched her fists, torn between embarrassment and something else she couldn't name. His hands moved with precision, and she hated how good it felt. "This is what happens when you defy me," he said, his voice low. "You lose the privilege of choice." Adrian's touch shifted, trailing up her leg with an almost imperceptible lightness. Ivy's breath hitched, and she gripped the arms of the chair. "Stop," she whispered, though her body didn't seem to agree. "Do you really want me to?" he asked, his voice dripping with challenge. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Adrian leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "You're fighting me, but you don't even know why." His hand slid higher, and Ivy's resolve shattered. She grabbed his shoulders, pulling him closer in a moment of desperation and confusion. Before she knew it, Adrian had swept her into his arms and carried her to the bedroom. Every rational thought fled as their bodies collided, the tension between them erupting like a firework. Adrian's touch was both demanding and intoxicating, leaving her gasping and grasping for more. She wanted to hate him, to push him away, but her body betrayed her, melting under his every movement. When it was over, Ivy lay tangled in the sheets, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She turned her head to look at Adrian, who was watching her with a satisfied smirk. "I don't understand why she trailed off, her cheeks flushing. Adrian leaned over her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You enjoyed it because you stopped pretending," he said softly. "And now you're afraid of what that means." Adrian cupped her chin, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach flip. "Defy me again," he said, his voice both a promise and a warning, "and you'll see how far I'm willing to go." Ivy's breath caught as he pulled away, leaving her to grapple with the storm he'd unleashed within her. Chapter 10. Ivy stared at herself in the mirror, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. It was the kind of gown she'd only ever seen in movies, sleek, emerald green, with a neckline that made her feel like she'd accidentally put it on backward. "Are you sure this is necessary?" she called out, her voice tight. Adrian's deep, calm voice floated in from the other room. "Entirely," she groaned, smoothing her hands over the fabric. "This thing doesn't even have pockets. What am I supposed to do with my hands?" "Keep them by your sides," Adrian said, appearing in the doorway like a dark storm cloud wrapped in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. His eyes swept over her, and a flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. "It suits you." Ivy crossed her arms, trying to hide her nerves. "I look like I'm auditioning for a spy movie." "Good," he said, stepping closer. "Now you look like you belong with me." Welcome to the world of sharks. The car ride to the event was quiet, but the tension was palpable. Ivy stared out the window, her fingers twisting together. "You'll be fine," Adrian said, his voice breaking the silence. She glanced at him. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one who's going to trip over your heels and face-plant in front of a crowd of billionaires." Adrian smirked. "If that happens, I'll make sure it's forgotten by morning." His confidence didn't make her feel better. If anything, it made her more nervous. When they arrived, Ivy's stomach dropped. The venue was a massive, glittering ballroom filled with people who looked like they'd stepped out of a high-fashion magazine. Adrian placed a hand on her lower back, guiding her inside. "Remember, Ivy, keep your head high. You're with me." Ivy did her best to blend into Adrian's shadow as he introduced her to an endless parade of polished smiles and fake laughter. Every greeting felt like an audition, and she was sure she was failing. But things took a sharp turn when a tall man with a wolfish grin approached them. His tuxedo was sharp, but there was something sharp in his eyes, too. like he enjoyed being a little dangerous. "Adrian," the man drawled, his tone smooth. "Always a pleasure." "Ethan," Adrian replied, his tone as cold as the ice in his whiskey. Ethan's gaze shifted to Ivy, his smirk widening. "And who is this?" Adrian's grip on her back tightened slightly. "Ivy Whitaker, my companion." "Companion," Ethan repeated, the word dripping with mockery. "Well, Ivy, did Adrian happen to mention that his companions rarely last?" Ivy's stomach twisted. "That's enough," Adrian said, his voice dangerously low. Ethan chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. "Oh, come now, Adrian. I'm just curious. Does she know what kind of man you really are? Or is she still dazzled by all this?" He gestured to the glittering room. Ivy wanted to disappear. Her cheeks burned and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Before she could process what was happening, Adrian turned her toward him, his hands firm but gentle on her arms. His eyes burned into hers, a mix of anger and possession. "Don't listen to him," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "He's trying to rattle you." "I'm already rattled," she whispered back. Adrian's jaw tightened. Then, without warning, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a soft, tentative kiss. It was fierce, commanding, and impossible to ignore. The room around them seemed to vanish as his lips moved against hers, claiming her in a way that left no room for doubt. By the time he pulled back, Ivy was breathless, her legs barely able to hold her up. The room buzzed with murmurs, but Adrian ignored them, his gaze fixed on hers. "You're with me," he said again, his tone softer now but no less intense. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Ivy stayed close to Adrian, trying to ignore the curious stares and whispered conversations. By the time they returned to the penthouse, her nerves were frayed and her head was spinning. Adrian closed the door behind them, his movements unhurried. He turned to her, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite name. "You did well tonight," he said. "Did I?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Because I feel like I just survived a shark tank." Adrian stepped closer, his hands finding her waist. "And yet, here you are, still standing." She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat as he pulled her against him. The kiss started slow, almost tender, but quickly deepened into something far more intense. Adrian's hands roamed her back, drawing her closer until there was no space left between them. Ivy's mind screamed that this was a bad idea, but her body didn't seem to care. She melted into him, her hands tangling in his hair as his lips moved to her neck. He guided her toward the bedroom, his touch firm but never harsh. Every movement, every whisper against her skin, was calculated to drive her wild. By the time they reached the bed, Ivy was lost in a whirlwind of sensations. Adrian's dominance was undeniable, but there was a surprising gentleness to his touch. Afterward, Ivy lay tangled in the sheets, her body still humming from the intensity of their connection. Adrian propped himself up on one elbow, his gaze unreadable as he watched her. "You're mine now," he said softly, his fingers tracing a lazy pattern on her arm. Her heart skipped a beat. "Don't forget it," he added, his voice both a promise and a warning. Ivy's mind spun with confusion and desire as Adrian's words echoed in her head. She didn't know what scared her more, the idea of being his, or the part of her that wanted to be.